In this video, I intend to address one of the bigger obstacles to convincing people of the value of skepticism and atheism. I think one of the most important roles religion plays in a person's life, if that person is ideally receptive to religion, is to relieve that person of the conflict between id and superego. For those not familiar with the Freudian concept of id, ego, and superego, the id represents a person's most base or appetitive desires, the biological desires for food, sex, or even some emotional desires like an unthinking desire to commit violence. Basically any desire that is not a result of contemplation. The superego is that part of our psychology that houses moral ideals. In it, we have a concept of our ideal selves, or an ideal way of behaving. The ego is a mediator between the two. It is the part of a person's psychology that tries to reconcile these two often opposing parts. It tries to find ways to satisfy our id-based desires for sex, food, revenge, or whatever, in ways that do not offend our superego-based ideals. At least this is my understanding of the id, ego, and superego. It may be an oversimplification. Nonetheless, I think this way of looking at the mind is a helpful way of modeling the phenomenon that I'm trying to explain. The struggle between the id and the superego is the source of all guilt, shame, embarrassment, self-loathing, etc. It is, I think, one of the greatest sources of human misery. I'm a big fan of movies that feature a protagonist that hyperzealously pursues a goal regardless of whatever challenge they may face, like Rudy or Gattaca, anything in which the main character is completely confident in the value of their goal. Because these protagonists, while they have to tackle a lot of very difficult obstacles, there is nonetheless something very enviable about them, because the obstacles they face are all external. They don't have to wrestle as much with their own psychology. They don't have to overcome doubts. These, I think, are the biggest challenges for most people. So the promise of the elimination of this tension between the id and the superego is very attractive. The way religion solves this problem, I think, is by uniting the id and superego through the very id-based emotions of fear and awe. When a person is presented with the concept of God, an all-powerful, morally perfect and aesthetically perfect being, and that person becomes convinced of this being's existence, this fills the id with awe and fear to such a degree that all other id-based feelings disappear. They are just completely crowded out. All desires then become desires wholly motivated by these two emotions. The person becomes completely willing to follow any rules that they are told are handed to them by this being. A person achieves a perfect agreement between id and superego, ending the internal psychological conflict. This is a very tempting prospect. This ends all feelings of guilt and shame. One no longer feels the temptation to engage in actions that make them feel guilty or shame. Or at least that's what happens when religion works. All too often, religion actually has the opposite effect. It increases the tension between the id and the superego by increasing the list of desires in which the id is forbidden to indulge, but does so without inspiring sufficient awe to drive those desires completely away. When this happens, religion becomes a source of misery. Nonetheless, the prospect of such an experience of awe continues to keep people religious despite the neuroses it causes. And a huge challenge to those who seek a secular and rational society is the fact that we have to contend with this promise of a guilt-free and shame-free life. Most people who lose their faith and become atheists do so because they either do not experience sufficient awe, or were only made more miserable by religion's arbitrary rules. Often Christians will ask atheists where they get their morality from if they don't believe in a god. And atheists usually find this question a bit silly and respond by asking the Christian if he would be out robbing and murdering if someone were to convince him that God did not exist. Sometimes the Christian says, yes, I would, while a lot of the time he's just being disingenuous in order to win the argument. There may very well be people who, in the absence of their religious beliefs, would be real pricks. They might even be dangerous. Too many atheists look at this phenomenon and say, well, that's just evidence that Christians are either bad people or they have some kind of mental pathology. And while that may be the case, simply stating that fact is not really posing a solution to this problem. Some time ago there was a Christian on YouTube who would ask atheists, what does atheism offer? The question was ill-posed, of course, because atheism is not really a worldview in and of itself. It's a conclusion one draws from a rationalist worldview. Now, rationalism offers a lot. It offers solutions to problems that actually work rather than superstitious solutions. Even so, what rationalism does not offer is a means of ending this conflict between id and superego. While being rational can help you decide what course of action will best allow you to accomplish your goals, it can't really tell you what those goals should be or why they are goals worth pursuing. It does not fill you with the awe necessary to crowd out competing and contrary desires. That, of course, is not to say that only religious people are capable of overcoming this internal conflict. Many rational people can do it as well. These are people who have been so completely consumed with whatever pursuit it is to which they have devoted their lives that they simply do not understand those who need these mystical fairy tales to make life worth living. So what's my point? My point is that going forward, Those who desire a more secular and rational society will have to acknowledge that while this dependence on mysticism may seem very childish, it cannot be overcome by simply pointing out the fact that it's childish. We will have to become evangelists for the worthiness of secular goals. We will need to become better at inspiring awe in the way we present those goals. We will have to offer a solution to this problem of overcoming the conflict between id and superego.